Howdy everyone, welcome back to the Gospel of John. In approximately 5 minutes, we're on day 12 today, and we're beginning chapter 6. Today we'll be going through verses 1 through 21, so grab your Bible and read along with us. Chapter 6, 1 through 21.
After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a multitude followed him, because they saw the signs which he did on those who were diseased. Jesus went up into the hills, and there sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a multitude was coming to him, Jesus said to Philip, "How are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat?" This he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in a number about 5,000. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign which he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the hills by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea rose because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat. They were frightened, but he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going.
Okay, everyone, so today we read about this miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000, right, with just 5 loaves of barley and 2 fish, and feeding 5,000 people, enough so that there was even 12 wicker baskets left over, right? This great miracle of Jesus. Now, what I want to focus on today is how this is in the context of the Passover. So one of the things that we presume about Jesus when we read the Gospels is that Jesus' public ministry lasted for 3 years. Do you know how we get that? Not only do we get it from church tradition, but also from the Gospel of John. Here in the Gospel of John, the Feast of Passover is mentioned 3 different times, right? So that's 3 years. Right, so today in chapter 6, when he fed the 5,000, it says this was during the Feast of Passover. Remember the Passover previously? That was in chapter 2, right? When Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, and when he had the miracle, the wedding at Cana. That was the first Passover mentioned in the Gospel of John. And now at the second Passover, we see that Jesus performs this miracle of feeding 5,000. And then in the next 2 days, we're going to read about how he gave what's called the Bread of Life discourse, right, about the Eucharist. And then, of course, the final Passover is the day of the crucifixion, right? So we see a common theme here in this Gospel of John teaching us about this new Passover Jesus is going to give us, right? It's prefigured 2 years before the crucifixion, when at the wedding at Cana, he turned water into wine. Right? A foreshadowing of the last Passover, in which he will turn his blood, or in which he will turn the wine from the Last Supper into his blood on the cross. Right? Here in the second Passover, Jesus is going to teach us about how he is the bread come down from heaven, and that he has a superabundant bread to give to us. And then finally on the cross and at the Last Supper, we're going to see how he gives us this new covenant Passover. Right? All of these images of the Eucharist are here. Now, one last thing I want to point out here, right? Obviously, as Catholics, we put a lot of emphasis on the Eucharist here. And here in the Gospel of John, we see a huge emphasis on the Eucharist. But one of the things that seems a little bit strange for someone who's reading the Bible for the first time and reading about the life of Jesus is the obvious question. How come the word Eucharist doesn't show up anywhere in the New Testament? We read about the bread from heaven. We read about Jesus' flesh and blood. Where does this word, the Eucharist, come from? Well, actually, it was mentioned in today's reading, only we're reading it in translation. It says, when Jesus took the fish and took the bread, after he had given thanks, then he dispersed it amongst the people. Eucharist is literally just the Greek word for thanksgiving. So if we were reading this in Greek, it would sound like Jesus took the bread, and after Eucharisting, then he dispersed it to the people. That's where the word comes from. So, join us again tomorrow as we move on to day 13, and we continue on with chapter 6.